that organization. And lastly, I think there is also the responsibility or the expectations the CHRO has to meet of the profession, namely the HR profession, and the values, and specifically, and I remember Vinay in his comments as a trailer to this, speaking of fairness. So both the values of the organization, the professional values, and specifically focused around fairness. That's the third set of expectations a CHRO has to meet. And the reason I mention these three is that it's not necessary that all three of them will coincide. And the challenge, the judgment, the courage, and the maturity of the CHRO exists in actually being able to deliver on all these. So having said that, let me come to the question which you have asked. Of course, again, the CHRO, the CEOs I had the good fortune to work with were all happily married. So no one actually woke me up at 3 a.m. They did come early to the office. So theoretically, we could meet at 7 o'clock in the morning, but I can't imagine getting together earlier than that. But jokes apart, I think the expectations of the CEO fall in three buckets. One is the long-term agenda that the CHRO has been brought on board for, or which he or she has crafted, which will include things like pioneering programs, large-scale change, and overall people quality enhancement at all levels in the organization. But there is a second one, which is, I think, a little more ticklish, which I will call the aspect of speaking truth to power. The people to whom I have spoken truth are still alive, some of them, so I will not give any personal examples. Maybe it's best if I take an analogy, which is also quite current in people's mind, of the role of chief of staff in the US president's office. And of course, we have seen a bit of a mockery of that role in recent years, but there's an excellent book called The Gatekeepers, which deals with how the best chiefs of staff have been known not for their appointment keeping and being gatekeepers, though that's the name of the book, but being able to speak unpleasant facts to the president. And I must say that my most fruitful CEO relationships have been where the CEO has welcomed, or I have earned, and it works both ways, this ability to, especially obviously in the people front. And because the arrogance or the missteps of CEOs can probably take place most in the realm of people, it falls, I think, more to the CHRO rather than, let's say, the R&D chief or the manufacturing chief to be the counselor and truth to power speaker. And lastly, and I think this is uppermost also in the questions which have come to you, there is the creative crisis management. In the current case, of course, we have the COVID crisis, which is a good example to take. So what is it that HR will do and CHRO will do and be expected to do by the CEO in this situation? And I would put these into three buckets. One is innovating immediate win-win solutions. To take an example from the COVID crisis, and I think it brings into some not so happy contrast with what we have been claiming that we understand the business. I think the need of the hour was for us to be able to re-engineer work processes such that they became safe and to communicate, train employees, get equipment designed for making these processes safe. Because I do believe work from home is available or possible only for a small part of the economy. So what HR should have focused on doing is for the rest. So that was the kind of immediate challenge. We can discuss later how well some did or didn't fare in it, but that's the kind of thing a CEO expects, that your normal job is not process design, but it is an adjacency. And when we come to the competencies, I will speak a little more about it. Before we get too carried away with doing things which are very distant from us, let's focus on our adjacencies, because that's what we are likely to be called on to deliver. Related to that, getting the government approvals for it and getting actually these certifiable supply chains going. The second part would have been, again, in the context of COVID, going a little outside our boundaries into the safety management domain, because a lot of companies, in their eagerness to start up, some have been reported in the press, some not, really inflicted harm to themselves and to the environment. So that was the second part. And the third would have been implementing systemic long-term solutions. For example, and I'm sorry if I'm going to be repeating this more than once in this session, here was a crisis which gave us, in fact, continues to give us the opportunity to get away from our addiction to the precariat, to contract labor. Here was an opportunity, and still continuing opportunity, for us to build belongingness, loyalty, by going back to a model where there is durable employment. And this was the crisis which spoke to that opportunity. And I think a good CEO should have expected HR to have taken that opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Visti. I think very important three aspects that you talked about. Long-term agenda, speak truth to power. I think that's something which a lot of us keep it in mind, but I think you have spoken, and very important aspect of being calling a spade for good of the organization. And I think creative crisis management, a holistic package. I think also very important point that you made is CEO is one of the stakeholders, and HR has responsibilities, little more than federal responsibility of multiple stakeholders, and the balance between all of them is the name of the game. Thank you for your candid views. I'll now move on to Sanjay. Sanjay has a CHRO in several companies, and running some of these companies. People talk about some of the gaps in each of the functional areas. HR is one area where people do have a lot of opinion about some of the gaps. Could you please share your view on what are some of these gaps that HR has, which we as fraternity should bridge it, and what could be some of the reasons for these gaps? Over to you, Sanjay.
So thank you, Srini, first of all, for having me here, and good afternoon to everyone. Pleasure being here. Before I move there, I just wanted to add a couple of more things to what Visti said.
Sure.
In the current context, there are 2-3 things that are immediate and pertinent for me if I'm a CEO to expect out of HR. As the businesses have put up business continuity plan, CEO is expecting an HR head to put PCP plan, people continuity plan. What are those things that we need to do now in terms of whether it is rationalizing increments and promotion, whether it is rationalizing manpower versus, looking at the various strata of management and reducing increments and things like that. So one piece that currently CEO expects HR guy to stand up and tell him that this is what we need to do. Second important thing is CEO is expecting HR to partner one of the very less partnered function in the organization to actually partner that function, which is a CIO function. He's expecting him to be partnering with the CIO in everything that you are doing in terms of either your digital transformation, either it is a work from home priorities, or creating the hybrid model as we get into the unlockdown model. And third, which Visti touched very succinctly, was re-engineering some of these processes, because the process is either two, and I called it as ACBC, because history will remember this time in two eras, BC before COVID and AC after COVID. 100 years later, people in the management will talk about how the management practices changed in BC versus AC. One of the things that we'll have to continually do is to re-engineer some of these things, especially employee experience, about the whole what you say edifice of HR engagement with people. I think these are three things that for me are extremely pertinent that CEO will look at HR person to guide him or work with him. Now the classical question of the gaps. One of the gap that we continue to hear, we have heard since the cows come home, that lack of understanding of business. I think there we have traveled quite a bit. There are CHROs who have now moved on and taken business roles, so on and so forth. But when you understand the business, there are two nuances in the business. Every business have some key drivers. Can you understand those key drivers? And for lack of any better explanation from somebody like me, which is where a service or a product gets converted into revenue, that particular driver, is HR able to understand or not? And I think that gap I continue to see, or I think some of the CEOs I talk, they continue to think that. So whereas people know that, there is a huge amount of work that is happening in space of managing people, engaging people, etc., etc. But when it comes to contribution on, either refining, defining the business drivers, etc., there is a lag that people notice as far as the CHRO is concerned. The second gap is on this digitization journey. Lots of CHROs are found wanting in the gap with the technology, and therefore I think lots of us have started doing kind of plug and play solutions, but we haven't done the kind of enterprise transformational HR solution as yet. There have been attempts on success factors and things like that, but many CEOs that I engage with, and some of them are a client, they say we struggle with HR person really going entirely digital and helping the organization get the benefits out of digitization. Broadly, I mean, there can be a much broader list that we have. We could talk about in terms of HR's, this whole understanding between. So one of the again classical thing is the engagement with the peers at the ManCom level, management committee level, or at board level. Again, comes from the fact that somewhere CHRO is found wanting in terms of appreciation of other functions, core area, and the knowledge, and therefore there is this inertia from some of his colleagues to engage with him deeply. So I mean, these are some of these things that the CEO thinks he continues to face with the CHROs. The solution, I think, is a appreciation by CHRO in terms of entire business landscape, understanding business. So one of the things that I used to at least practice, and I see many of my colleagues practice, is spend more time in business than in HR itself, because somehow the function has become extremely self-appreciating function. You have a particular budget allocated, how well you utilize that budget, and you did learning and OD initiatives and things like that. Deployment of that and ROI on that, and how sales rep in the distributor is performing. Can you spend time with the distributor? Can you spend time with the medical doctor, etc., etc.? So spending much more time there will certainly help CHRO to get a little more hands-on knowledge of more than, I would say, business, the entire experience of the whole process that is happening. As people say, experience is not something what you learn, but what you do with what you learn. And I think that's where the application part will become more effective. We some of us continue to struggle on numbers, and so basic understanding of balance sheets and so on and so forth. So some of these areas, they do get highlighted in the conversations. But I think I don't sound pessimistic. I'm always optimistic. CHROs have traveled pretty long distance now, and I see a much better informed business leader as CHRO. And some of the solutions that companies continue to employ is to give CHRO function to non-business and non-HR person like Chandru, yourself, that Piramal did, and they were extremely delighted with what you contributed. I think that kind of cross-fertilization or a T growth to people is one good solution that CEO look at. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sanjay. I think 2-3 elements that you talked about, PCP, people continuity plan, I think very important, given that some hard decisions have to be taken, certain different ways of working has to be taken, candid feedback has to be given. I think PCP is a great thing that you talked about. You also touched upon a very interesting aspect of almost collaborating very well with the CIO and focusing a bit on digitization and technology, etc. Often, CFO and CHRO collaboration is spoken about. There are a lot of case studies, but I think this is a great angle to look at. Given the situation, work from home, and so many new systems, processes, workflow, technology that we are talking about, the partnership of CIO and CHRO probably is one area where each one of us have to learn more out of it. I think very important aspect that you touched about, business drivers and digitization, technology, etc. for HR, which kind of remains a gap, to say so. A lot of companies have made efforts, but I think a lot more can be done. Incidentally, one of the clients that we work with, fairly large new age internet company with about 10,000 odd employees, one of the $7 billion company. One of the work we did with HR is almost did a few series of sessions on value drivers, which means up to 12 levels, what are different ways in which revenue is earned, or interlinkage of the actions that each of the functions take, which has some implication on revenue and financials. As you rightly said, a lot of people have made a lot of efforts, but I think that's one area which people need to focus about. As I keep talking to B-school students and keep asking them one question, how many annual reports have you read? I think that's an important question to each of the HR people to ask ourselves, that have we understood the business model and read the annual report of a company? Yeah. Thanks for that, Sanjay. Over to Vinay, if you want to add something to what Sanjay has spoken on the question that I've asked to Visti. And then the question to you is, what are some of the best practices that you have seen in your vast career of 37 years, where the gaps that Sanjay talked about, how companies have managed to bridge that, and what were some of the tangible results that business could look at? Over to you, Vinay.
Yeah, so I fully agree with what Visti and Sanjay just mentioned. But I would like to go a little bit back to basics. What has happened over a period of time that HR has forgotten its basic responsibility of keeping people happy. And happy not just from a point of view of having fun Fridays, but happy from the point of view of whether there is enough psychological safety available in the organization, whether when the times are good or when the times are bad or challenging as we see today. Today's scenario is something which is being talked about in this various seminars I've been attending in the last decade. We called it the VUCA world. We spoke about uncertainties. We listened about how to gear up. But when it actually came in front of us, what have we done to keep the morale of people as high as we are supposed to be as HR people? That is something which bothers me even today. I think any good CEO who has moved in a leadership position after adequate grooming in his own company or from elsewhere understands this. And that's the chord between the good CHRO and a good CEO. to actually manage this challenge, cope with this challenge, and allow employees to feel as safe psychologically as possible as they used to feel in good times. So I think getting back to basics also means revisiting all the HR levers in a proper way and adapt it to the current scenario, which is actually the VUCA which has happened. Now, what is that? Now, how do you deal with performance management in this situation? How do you deal with compensation in this situation? How do you deal with hiring in this situation? What happens to people who you had made offers and now you don't have money to, absorb them? How do you deal with that? Whether it is a question of ethics or fairness, or whether it is a question of business continuity, how do you manage the tipping point between the two extremes? And how do you allow the CEO to take a right, prudent decision in this kind of a challenge which he is also facing? Are we also making him understand that if somebody spoke about HR understanding the balance sheet, if you have built a huge reserve and surplus in your company, are you encouraging the CEO to use that to maintain this psychological safety in some way by providing the right kind of assistance to people to manage their income and commitments which they have over a period of time? Or you're just taking a clean cost control approach where you say the CEO wants to cut costs by 25% and therefore we will reduce salaries by 25% or we will reduce headcount by 25%. That's very easy to do. It doesn't take an HR person to do that. Any CFO can do that. Or anybody can do that. Why CFO? Why make CFO a villain? So basically, some organizations have made HRs the villain by asking them to do these things without giving them a choice of understanding and creating other innovative solutions to keep this psychological safety on. What are you going to do when things turn around and everything becomes very normal and you get back into that growth phase? Because all of us are trained well to work in a growth kind of an environment. We basically do all our assessment centers, talent management, to understand how will you grow business, how will you grow business. But there is no such assessment where we see what will you do to turn around. What will you do when there is a challenge? What will you do when there is a shrinkage? Even startups, they are very optimistic from the point of view what is going to happen after 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. They present to the venture funds. But they are, when you ask them a question, how are you going to earn money today? There is always a question mark on their face. I believe that HR is supposed to give that courage, confidence to the CEO. Although we all agree that business of business is business and not charity. But also you should also not forget that business of HR is to keep its employees humanly happy. And that happiness is not at the cost of responsibility. So if you have a responsible workforce, I think the challenge of productivity will get addressed. They themselves will come out with innovative solutions to park funds which do not unnecessarily get spent as salaries without work. Working from home has become a new challenge, but we will look into that from a different perspective. I think working from home was at one time a dream of every employee. And today the dream is, when do I get back to office? Now, how are we going to manage these two extremes? because there is always some psychological element of friendship which exists. Now, speaking about engagement, for example, I think there is a team which is working in a company which is very deeply engaged with each other. And I think the organization, of course, is an assemblage of people who work towards a common goal. This is all theory. We've all learned it over the years. However, when a new employee joins the team and if everything at workplace is becoming virtual, is he going to be as deeply engaged as the original team, which was together in the physical format? Now, how do we address these solutions? Now, making the CEO aware of these challenges is also one of the tasks as a friend I think we should do. The 3 a.m. friend is somebody who he can call up whenever he is in a difficulty. And has HR provided that confidence to him? Whether HR has provided that confidence that he can be fair yet productive and make the company sail through this crisis. And that's what is the HR's challenge today. I think we should all gear up to look at. And my only advice would be look at the HR function from a very basic point of view. What is it supposed to be?
Thanks a lot, Vinay. I think a very fundamental point that you talked about, saying that why do we exist as a function? And what are some of the elements that we need to manage as a function is one way of looking at it. I think a couple of points that you made me think. One is essentially that it's not just about knowing the balance sheet. It is how do you, as an example or as a anecdotal evidence, it's not about knowledge alone, but how do you apply to the people principles and the basic fundamentals of keeping people happy. You also talked about, touched upon the fact that friendship is two-way, and 3 a.m. is more symbolic of, a CEO having more confidence on, HR as a thinking partner, as a business partner on the table. We have quite a few questions also coming in, so I'll move to the next question and over to you, Visti. The question, all of us, how would I put it? The whole world, many of the people are trained how to be good time managers. Growth, merger acquisition, 20% growth, right? Launching new products. Probably we have a lot of good time managers. Probably we don't have too many good bad time managers, which means all of us are trained for probably good times and great times that one talks about. However, many of us are not trained for degrowth, crisis management, so on and so forth. What is your view on this question, and some things that HR can pick up a canvas to paint to ensure that this aspect of the training of an organization to build a lot of good managers even in bad times, what should HR do about? Over to you, Visti.
Thank you. Srini, I'm going to take the liberty once again of stepping back to something which Vinay said.
Absolutely. Please feel free.
Then come back to this point.
Absolutely.
Of course, I was nodding my head vigorously every time he said the word employee happiness. That's very much, I think, the holy grail for HR. And also he said something fundamental, that HR should know the basics. And I would like to comment on that in the context of both normal operations as well as operations in duress. That unless you know your basics well, you cannot react in moments of crisis. So I think the competencies relating to HR, I would like to put them into 4 buckets. I'm dealing in a lot of buckets today, I'm sorry. But there are 2 sets of buckets which fall in the middle, which are the functional competencies, and which is what I believe Vinay was referring to when he said we should know the basics of those. Those are also the ones where we need to have advanced capabilities in some of them. So let me take an analogy from the world of medicine. As you know, I've been exposed to doctors quite a bit in recent days. So supposing there is someone who gets a heart attack in a film theater or in an aircraft, someone is going to shout out, is there a doctor in the house or on this plane? No one asks, is there a cardiac specialist on the plane? The point being that every doctor worth the name is supposed to know a certain basic degree. And by the way, when we are in an emergency situation, many of the things we are required to do are those basic things, but we have either never learned them or did them so long back while we have been playing with our sophisticated models that we can't deliver on those. Very often in a crisis, a senior person may be asked to do something which normally he or she would have relied on the team. And now for various reasons of communication, XYZ, the team may not be available. This person has to do it. So therefore, on the functional competencies, just like a doctor is supposed to know throughout his life, he can't say that now I've become a very big guy, I will not deal with this guy who has a heart attack in the plane. He has to do it. But equally, just as we finally trust a doctor for his specialization, there are a few things which over the career you should become very good with. And even if ultimately you are going to be a specialist. So there are three things we are talking of. One is basic knowledge of a whole variety of functional skills. Specialist knowledge where, like a doctor, the best people will turn to you, or in the case of HR, you will develop thought leadership models, people will follow you. Or as a generalist, when you become a CHRO, you need to be able to lead specialists in terms of delivering the organization strategy. That would be like the medical director of a hospital, as your friend is. So all three facets which are in the world of medicine play out here. And when people say you should know the business, and I think that also Vinay said that, yeah, it's great if you read the balance sheet, but I am not, if I'm the CEO, I'm not going to come to you for getting my balance sheet read. I'm going to come to you for my manpower plan, my recruitment strategy, my talent management. So do you know those? So that's the first part. Each organization also has a set of behavioral competencies, but there are some behavioral competencies which are especially important for HR. And to respond to your question, they become particularly crucial in moments of crisis. Some of those are being credible, being service-oriented, not discriminating. I mean, those are special attitudinal characteristics which are necessary for a CHRO, but which people should be able to trust you when, for example, people are working remote and they don't have day-to-day chance to verify whether you are walking the talk. Now, I'm not going to elaborate on these because both these sets of competencies have been put together in various models. The one which I personally refer to often is one which I assisted in creating. I see that Arvind Agarwal, my friend and the leader of the team for for NHRDN, which worked on these competencies, is also on this call. So those exist. There is a background to them. The point only there I'm making is that you can't get away from learning those in order that you talk general management stuff to the general manager. Like I said, the general manager already knows general management. He's counting on you for HR. But I come back to your basic question about competencies needed in the context of crisis, and sandwiching these two, which I mentioned, namely the functional and the attitudinal competencies, are two more sets. The first one are the foundational competencies. And why foundational is important is that in a crisis, you normally need to think from first principles. So unless your foundations are strong, if you have learned to do appraisals as a technique and you keep repeating it with minor changes, that's not good enough. Suddenly you are confronted with having to do coaching remote or appraisals in a remote fashion. That's in the current context, but there could be many different ones where you need to go back to the principle of what was the appraisal meant for? How does it help performance? What does it do to development? And then build a totally new process, which is no longer even remotely similar to the old, but delivers the same results. So briefly, what are these foundational competencies? I would say the first is understanding people, and that goes in two parts. One is the fundamentals of behavioral science, from which we are able to derive these kind of processes, and based on which we can do research to continue adding to a sound knowledge base and not just pick up fashion or fads from colleagues. But equally important is how should people behave? So here we come back again to the ethical standards, or what we call the code of conduct, or the fair organization code, can go by many names, that this is something we need to have as a yardstick, and its ramifications, because it shows up in the way we do recruitment, it shows up in the way we allow pay differentials to develop, it shows up in the way we treat the communities where we operate, it shows up in the way we deal with unions and manipulate them or partner them, etc. So that is the second foundational component. I call these foundational because I think for HR, it's better to select people with them rather than hope that you will build foundational competencies, because there are a limit to how much remedial education you can do. The second is, of course, this is important in several other functions, but for HR particularly, is the ability to influence people. I think one of your questions earlier also said influencing people without authority. For HR, that is essential par excellence. And influencing people in one-to-one or small group situations, but equally importantly, HR frequently has the occasion to have to influence people in large groups, whether it is a open house or an other communication session. And the third and newer one, which again found mentioned by Sanjay and you, is communicating through the digital media, because you now have to, if someone is working from home, how are you going to communicate and get the same responsiveness, credibility, etc. And last foundational competency, very rightly, which has been repeated several times, are the foundational competencies relating to the business. There are three functions which HR should know basics thoroughly: finance, marketing, and IT. And in each of these, there are ramifications and updatings, and all of that will happen. But these three functions, there is no question, but HR should know. And pulling them all together is a basic understanding of strategy, because unless strategy of business is translated into strategy of HR, then nothing holds. So these three, standing on a base of strategy, are, I think, the business foundations which every HR person should bring in order to be able to operate sensibly. The last bucket of competencies, and which is critical, but I will not spend much time on it because I spoke about it earlier, is the adjacencies, the adjacent competencies. So for example, adjacent to HR, I think, is industrial engineering. So all of the example I gave, that in many cases HR failed to create re-engineered processes, that's because we just haven't applied our mind to an adjacent competency while thinking we will apply our mind to some business model somewhere else. No, your adjacencies must come first. it's like, again, I go back to the medical analogy. There is a medical officer in the border with China in the army. The general is not going to ask him about where to attack the Chinese contingent next, but he is going to consult him on not necessarily just medical ailments, but how should we perhaps design our tents at this high altitude so that people with PTSD are enough recovered to go back. So it is something to do with the health part, but also perhaps equipment design, ergonomics, etc. It's similar for us. So let's be competent in our adjacencies. Then the second adjacency I would consider is environment, health, and safety. I mean, there are most organizations have a pillar outside of HR, but it is adjacent to HR, and it behooves HR to know almost as much as the people in that adjacency. So really, I think the knowledge of the adjacencies is what you are called upon most to deliver in a crisis. If you don't know it, that's not the time you're going to learn how to do a layout and so on. So in preparing yourself, know your functional competencies, possess the attitudinal competencies, come in with the foundational competencies, and acquire the adjacent competencies is where I would sum it up.
Dr. Srini, we can't hear you.
I'm audible now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think what Visti talked about is back to basics, basic functional areas, and how do you build on specializations, and how do you know 2-3 functions, at least at a peripheral level with some amount of depth, which would prepare you for any kind of contingencies, because what is going to come is most uncertain, and thanks for the medical analogy. I think that made a lot of things clear. There are a lot of questions which are coming in. So my next question, I'll connect all of these questions and over to you, Sanjay. And of course, if you want to add to something to what Visti has talked about in the previous question, feel free to do that. Pandemic has been playing, COVID-19 and pandemic has been playing on our minds for each one of us. Each one of us are associated with multiple companies. And when we talk, I think that's a large problem that each one of us are thinking about. What is your advice, apart from basic hygiene like health, safety of employees, etc.? What should CHRO to do post-pandemic when offices started opening up and most of those things to maintain the morale of the people, to ensure that the people continuity plan is on, things like mental health, etc., which intuitively all of us practiced in our decades of experience, but may not be proactively. How do we ensure that all these elements of team spirit and things beyond mandatory HSE, HR, HR should be driving it? Or in other words, your top 3 advice to all the HR fraternity on this call of things that they should focus upon post-pandemic. Over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you, Srini. There are 2, I would put them in Visti's language, 2 buckets. One is on the hard side and one is on the soft side. The hard side is automatically, we know about it now post the COVID guidelines in terms of redesigning the whole working space in terms of social distancing norms, redesigning your cafeterias. Now JLL has come with 6x6 office. They are saying that the whole office infrastructure is devised in a way that you enter a particular way, pick up your stationery on the way, and get into your 6 feet by 6 feet cubicle. And the interaction that is allowed to you with 60 minutes time, again with some 6 feet kind of a box that is created and things like that. So one is on that. Second is again on the hard side is about the whole ecosystem of medical support on site to give confidence in terms of safety, hygiene, so on and so forth. So institutionalizing that at least in the foreseeable time till we actually get vaccine in place, which we don't know how far it is. But on the on the softer side, there are many challenging issues that CHRO will have to engage with. First and foremost, we have to now recognize that, the famous Maslow's theory of hierarchy of needs, where we had traveled to some level 4 or level 5 self-actualization, has suddenly dropped to level 2 now. It is that safety level. It is that security level. And therefore, in thinking of your applying solution, you'll have to keep this in back of your mind. You can't be esoteric now, henceforth, by giving people the solutions for their self-actualization need, whereas they today need a safety need. Today they need continuity need. Today they don't know whether their job is secure or not. Today they don't know what are going to be their increments, are they coming or not. So applying that thought in your mind as you devise your, and I'm giving this as an interim solution. I'm not saying that long term this will play out, but in the future that we foresee now, next 6 months to 9 months, this is imperative. And therefore we may have to revisit our entire employee value proposition in terms of the framework itself. And I'm not saying basic pillars to be tweaked with, but ensuring the elements of safety, security, job security, redesigning the entire your medical plan, redesigning your benefits plans, etc., should be given priority in the short run that CHROs will have to do. And I'm taking it for granted that there is a huge uncertainty lurking. Even when people are going to offices now, and I keep talking to them, somewhere it is 33%, somewhere it is 10%. When morning they leave and they come back in the evening, they're not very sure in terms of whether they have, infection will get to them, or are the office places secure and things like that. So on the morale, on the well-being side, if at all we've done so much so far, we'll have to do much more than that today, because that's where again the ball is lying today, that people will feel insecure for the time being. And therefore attending to that need will be again very central in terms of, it is given for granted now that hybrid model of work will happen in future, where job outcomes are purely dependent on computer and phone. Those jobs will become work from home. But where there is a physical interface needed, those jobs will not shift to home, but they will continue to exist in the form of flesh and blood and people interfacing in the office. Now, how do you design your entire, like Vinay was saying, the entire HR architecture on the hybrid model will be a new challenge to the CHRO. So re-engineering HR processes, whether it is comp plan, whether it is a performance management system, whether even it is productivity. How do you track productivity? Especially when the productivity is collaborative in nature. At the lower middle level or operating level, the productivity is all team linked, collaborative linked. And if work from home is becoming part of life, or hybrid model is there, how do you track the productivity, team productivity? Some of these will require immediate and urgent attention from CHRO. Some of them have started focusing on that. I know for sure. I think Deepak Deshpande is on the call here. He works for NetMagic. They have done a fantastic job in terms of getting people safety, and they're a continuous operation company. So in terms of restarting entire thing, getting laptops organized, getting permissions organized, today they are doing lots of morale building initiatives. They have also gone and said that we will not give increments, but if you meet your target at the end of the year, this increment amount equivalent will be given and added to your performance pay, something like that. So proactive engagement with people and ensuring that trust is rebuilt. Empathy, compassion and trust are going to be three lenses that CHRO more than CHRO. A business leader or the whole organization or the leadership team will have to engage with the people as they come to work. But I heard this somewhere, if business understood the language of love, there would have been no recession ever. And I think it's very fundamental, because if that's the basic tenet of a human existence, if we are able to reinforce that in this crisis and post-crisis and imbibe that into entire leadership values and culture, then I think the organization will be extremely grateful to that CHRO that he's done something really, really good for the organization. Thank you.
And wonderful, Sanjay. I think the language of love that you talked about, which is another way of saying that, how do you build this culture DNA of love across the organization, I think has come out very clearly. You also emphasized a lot on communication, probably without using the word, on how do you create these systems that it's transparent. You gave an example of one of the companies that you talked about. One of the companies we are associated with had given an option of voluntary pay cut after 3 months into COVID. First 3 months, there was a pay cut. The pay cut was restored. And in fact, last couple of days in the newspapers, the company was mentioned. What they're now doing is asking for a voluntary pay cut, and probably 5% of the employees have volunteered, and giving them ESOPs at a very friendly price in lieu of this. I think all of these ideas, comp structure, etc., is to bring in that sense of belongingness, and that the problem is a shared problem and it's not a top-driven problem. I think has come out very, very clearly in your conversation, Sanjay. You also talked about the softer aspects, because normally in conversations when we talk about HR for HR, etc., the conversations are very left brain centric, if I can say so. Is now moving to right brain centric. I think very important. I now move on to Vinay. Vinay, obviously, yeah. Please go ahead. Visti, you had some point. Go ahead, please.
Supplement what Sanjay said. I have no argument at all with what he has explained as very vital part of the present crisis and immediately going forward. And when you said the need for belonging, I will stress again that belongingness comes to people whom you have taken the trouble to employ,
Absolutely.
not people whom you convert into migrant labor at the first sign of difficulty. But that apart, I would like to take your question in the somewhat medium and long term, what HR could do after having learned from this crisis. And I think one thing which this crisis told us about many HR departments, fortunately not all, is that HR, with all its sophistication, has become extremely fragile. And I use fragile in the sense that Taleb uses it. And the point is that if you are fragile, then any situation outside of the limits to which you have specified shatters you. So his whole thesis on anti-fragility, I have translated into the context of HR, that HR needs to become anti-fragile. What does anti-fragile mean? That resilience is what allows you to take a shock and not break. But anti-fragile is when you get a shock and you become stronger. What is it that's necessary for HR to become anti-fragile? I think should be the longer term goal for us. And many of the things Sanjay suggested are in that direction, but somewhat specific to COVID. I would like to give a couple of instances. This is obviously not comprehensive. But in many, many situations, the black swan is likely to affect our ability to run a complex organization globally in the manner in which we have become accustomed to, whether it is our global supply chain or communication. Fortunately, this time communications weren't affected. So we are all merrily saying work from home is a solution. Imagine a crisis. It's not so difficult to imagine when you are thinking of China and its cyber war capabilities, that your communications are jeopardized. So it's not possible to anticipate a specific crisis, but for example, if we look at anti-fragility, what is it that HR should do? We need to work on the ability of smaller parts of our organization to work relatively autonomously, relatively without long distance communication, if not for sustained periods of time, at least for some time. These new systems will come at a cost in efficiency, just as when we give up global supply chains, there is a cost in efficiency, but we pay that cost for being shielded from the shocks. Even if we cannot design the organization to permanently operate like that, and I would refer people to Team of Teams, which General McChrystal wrote on exactly how to meet this objective. But that apart, at least we should then have a contingency plan that when such a crisis strikes, let us say no communications between headquarters and plant, how are we going to manage? Who will take charge? Who will decide what? What will he be authorized to decide? Otherwise, this guy doesn't know, because all along he's used to going to his finance head for sanction beyond this. Now he has to decide. So that's one way of preparing to become anti-fragile. Let me take another example at the micro end, at HR itself. You know, when the COVID crisis struck, I was quite amused to see some of the dialogues in HR WhatsApp groups where I'm a member. How will we do our coaching online? The whole world has come to a stop. Don't worry about coaching. So we need to be clear that do we have separable processes, and we don't know which processes will be necessary and which processes will have to be turned off. But we do need to identify either permanent process owners or process owners who will come in an emergency, and certain processes will go on the back burner. Certain processes will just kind of mark time, and some will become vital. For example, in most cases, I imagine our employee contact programs of whatever sort will need to be more activated in an emergency, because that's the time everyone is feeling nervous, under pressure, and so on. And how will they cope when normal channels are disrupted, or strange things are happening in people's city or lives? So I think the goal for us should be anti-fragility. Many ideas can come. I've just given a flavor of a couple, but I think that should be our long-term goal.
Thanks a lot, Visti, for this. Over to you, Vinay, for your views on this question. And the next question, probably linked to this, is as a consequence of COVID, and therefore the challenges in the business which started happening, we are seeing a lot of job losses in most of the organizations. Somewhere it could be as bad as 70% in a new age company, to a 5-10% in relatively traditional companies, if I can say so. We as HR fraternity, what are some of the ideas that we could do to deal with this growing job losses? And it has got a cascading effect. It starts with some of the offers being given to management trainees, which are being retrieved from the B school, getting into job cuts in some place, and complicated interlinkages, what it is showing. Any views on how we as HR fraternities try to address this problem? Over to you, Vinay.
Yeah, so first is I would like to thank Visti for bringing up the Black Swan. I am a fan of this particular concept of anti-fragile. And I also liked what Sanjay said about the basic 2 layers of Maslow's hierarchy coming into play. So now job losses, will have to look at both of these phenomena. Where are we in that terms? And how are we innovating? A lot of organizations and people individually who have gone out of their way to help people on streets, people who are migrant laborers, who were not able to go back home, were not able to survive, in terms of their genuine desire to help. But do we create an ecosystem within our organization to help those who will be subject to job cuts? Probably, if it is inevitable. I'm not saying that HR should look at it as a primary solution to this crisis. However, if this is inevitable, are we creating some kind of a fund to support these people in the interim? Are you able to create a scenario where when you bounce back, these people will have the desire to come back and work for you again? It is like the layoff of the old industrial relations uh, law, which says that if you have laid off people, they should be moved out on last come, first go, and they should be taken in as first come, first go. I think these principles need to be looked at from more of a human angle and not from a legalistic perspective. While we will take care, I think many organizations are used to what Sanjay mentioned about creating an environment which is safe for physical work. Pharma companies are already doing it. People who work in microbiology hospitals, they already do it. Now it's a question of training the other people to that extent. Now coming back to your question, Srini, on this 70% kind of job losses, they should not happen all of a sudden. There has to be some kind of a phasing of this and some innovative solutions. I don't think we are here in this panel today to provide direct solutions to the audience, but some innovative concepts, like I would like to reflect upon some experience of a leave bank. We created a leave bank in one of my companies, previous companies, where people exhausted their leave and others donated 1 day. Can we not do a salary bank? Can we not create a pool of funds from those who have higher reserves to support such people till the time that the business comes back to normal? There are some businesses which will never come back to normal, and that kind of a situation is being very pessimistic. But I don't think all businesses are going to be suffering to that extent. There will be businesses which will go through a spike of low, a dip of a low, and come back slowly. There will be a plateau effect, and then they will come back to a normal. It's like the Sensex. You know what happened about 4 months back, and now what is happening today. I think slowly, gradually, we are improving. I think that confidence should come in the minds of people as well. That those of us who are better paid, who have better reserves or savings, and that includes the company because it has earned in the past and it has its reserves, are they willing to create a pool like a CSR to help these people who are going to lose their jobs temporarily, permanently, and otherwise? I mean, they could be different buckets. I like the bucket analogy used by Whiskey, so I'm using it here. So can you do these buckets? People who are not going to be there permanently, people who are going to be changed for the purpose of, can you do a role change for them? So a lot of innovations can happen. Can we do a fund bank for them? Can we create a benevolent fund for unemployment? So these are the kind of solutions I feel one should innovate. And being innovative is the best solution in this scenario.
Thanks, Vinay. Talking about salary bank, good food for thought for all of us. We have another 10 minutes and a couple of more questions. So maybe before that, yeah, go ahead, please. Visti and Sanjay, I'm sure you'll have some points. Please go ahead.
I'm sorry to barge in once again, but I was inspired by what Vinay said to comment. As he said, are the people who can afford it, which is, let's say, the CXO level, the level below that, to what extent have they felt at least a financial pinch before at lower levels people have started losing jobs? I think that's a very right question, and I would pose it. I would go further to say that when we say that people are our most important assets, I presume we are saying they are our most important assets until COVID strikes. We don't say that. We say they are our most. So if these assets have to be disposed, I would also like to see what other assets have we disposed. Have we sold off our land? Have we sold off buildings? Have we sold off other assets before we say that this shouldn't be the first asset and we are calling it our most important asset? That's a contradiction. So there is a believability to when you do this and how inevitable it is. And similarly, what is the level-wise trade-off? If I am letting go of 1,000 people at the bottom of the pyramid, have I let go of proportionately the same or perhaps even more people whose salaries multiply the salaries per head here by manifold? So I think the test for all of this is, if the company is in such dire straits, what has it done to senior level salaries, senior level positions, and other assets? But I will now go to kind of round off the question with which you started, which was expectations of the CEO from the CHRO. And I'll put in this context expectations from HR or the people of the company to the CEO and to the promoter. And lest it be thought that I am suggesting something which is totally fairy tale, I am going to quote from something which actually happened in Tata's. And since I quoted it in a column of mine, I apologize to people who've already read it, but it's only 2 sentences. This came from Rusi Lala's book, The Creation of Wealth. One day a telegram came from Jamshedpur that there was not enough money for wages. In November 1924, 4 years to the centenary, the steel company was on the verge of closing down. Sir Dorab Tata pledged his entire personal fortune of rupees 1 crore, including his wife's jewelry, to obtain a loan of 1 crore from the Imperial Bank of India for a public limited company. So people wonder why Tatas have, to an extent even today, but certainly when I joined, a huge amount of equity. These are the kind of historically true episodes. I am submitting that this year is the opportunity for many, many companies to create that kind of reputation which will last them at least 100 years down the road.
Great. Thanks for that point. In many ways, this is kind of a proof of pudding, if I can say so, of showing the real DNA of the organization. I think very important aspect that you talked about, people are important asset. Is there an asterisk or is there no asterisk? I think it's a very powerful question that we need to ask ourselves and the respective CEOs. I also like the way you said where it's not just a one-way CEO asking HR expectation, but HR's expectation from CEO. Thanks for that, Visti. Sanjay, any last 2-3 minutes comments, since a few dozens of HR professionals are there and very senior professionals are also there. Anything that you may want to sum up, 2-3 minutes of summing up for you, Sanjay?
Not really. On the same point, I wanted to submit that, as Norman Schwarzkopf said, leadership is combination of strategy and character. And if you have to live without one, it better be strategy. In the leadership is only tested at the time of crisis, and we are going through a crisis. So why the people loss or job losses should come as the first thing in a mind to a CEO as a response to this situation is fundamentally, I wanted to kind of question. Also, it depends on the industry that you work. In services industries, your people cost is almost like 70% of your total cost. In manufacturing, it could be 6% of your total cost. So apply the yardstick as per the industry that you are in. And the solutions that Vinay suggested were very, very doable. outplacement service, for example, wherever it was possible. There are good organizations which are doing that. You should do that. But if I have to summarize this, that this crisis has really thrown a big challenge to organizations, which all the organizations, but we are really clearly seeing people between winners and the also ran from the point of view of what just Visti talked about, Tata Sons. The character of the organizations are getting visible. And I think for any good organization and its CHRO, it is imperative that he holds that particular can of employee advocacy, that particular can of what should I say, consciousness at the board level table, and brings this to the fore time and again by saying that if we do this, this is what will look like. And in today's world, for us to look like in the world which is so well connected in social media, that your visible look is as important as your integral look. And I think this particular role CHRO will have to play very, very effectively as we move forward.
Yep.
And my favorite is this: trust, empathy, compassion is going to be the only thread that's going to bind till humanity exists. And therefore, it better be more and more reflected by leadership as they move ahead and take any decisions, whether it is severances, whether it is growth, whether it is future business strategy. Edifice of that should be built on these three particular humane aspect of life.
Thanks a lot, Sanjay. As Professor Sumantra Ghoshal, late Professor Sumantra Ghoshal used to say, smell of the place is most important for, and smell has to be consistent across the organization. In many ways, you touched upon the fact that things like trust, empathy, etc., should be the DNA of the organization. Thanks for that. Vinay, you have the last word.
Yeah, so it's all in the family. I think we should look at what would you have done if this happened in your own family. If there was a crisis in the family, what happens? I think we have unlearned ourselves, and we look at organizations as a separate entity and the family as a separate entity. The camaraderie which we see in a family, is it possible to be extended in our organization beyond our own personal departmental teams? And that is going to be the great elevator for ascertaining psychological and basic safety. And we should also learn to differentiate between wants and needs in this crisis. I think what happens in a family is a clear indicator what can be used in an organization also. What is essential, what is not essential. Even the government has done that. Essential services will continue. That is food, milk, etc. Other things will be closed. So can we do something like that in an organization also and extend it beyond a time frame and say that in this time period we will be using this kind of a thing. And those who are better paid will help the people who are not paid well or are below the thing. There is something called surplus income. I'm not an economist, but I would say that in a situation that what is the portion of your salary are you spending regularly in a month, and how much of your salary or income is going into your savings which you invest elsewhere. Now, can that part of the fund be used for welfare of people who don't have that luxury of this? I think overall, if we work like a family, the whole situation can be dealt with. Basically, again, I go back to basic and emphasize, I would like to re-emphasize that HR's first job, first loyalty is to bring happiness to its people in the organization, so that they are attached to you in the long run, as we see our family members attached to each other. And that's my final take.
Thanks a lot, Vinay. Thanks a lot to the panel for sharing their rich experience with specific examples. I think if I have to sum up in 3 lines, one, I think each one of us as members of this HR fraternity should have the intellect, humility to learn basics, fundamentals of business and certain basics. Second important point, I think each one of us should have a voice to say what is right, or what are the consequences of not doing, and being a balance between profit and people, and not just drive the CEO's agenda on an as-is basis. And I think third and most important aspect is a balance between left and right side of the brain, creating DNA, creating the camaraderie feeling, getting that team spirit, getting that sense of belongingness, investing in people, creating happiness, and at the same time things like productivity and the rational part of the brain, to say so. Thank you so much. A lot for me to learn, from this panel, and I'm sure each of these participants also must have taken away. Special thanks to a lot of participants who had asked questions. Dr. Deepak Deshpande, thank you so much for those wonderful questions and points that you had. Dr. Arvind Agarwal, thank you for your comments. Dr. T.V. Rao, thank you so much for being on this call and answering a couple of questions. So thank you once again to each one of you. We'll continue this as a series of discussion with different points, and our next talk probably would be in the last week of July or first week of August. That would be more around ESOPs and long-term incentives. We'll share the details with you. Thank you so much for being on this panel. Thank you, Visti. Thank you, Vinay. And thank you, Sanjay, for sharing your rich experience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Visti.